Thank you, Carolyn, and good afternoon, everyone. As Carolyn stated, my name is Alan Brown, and I am, hold on, I'm having some, hold on, got it. I had technical difficulty for a moment there. Again, my name is Alan Brown, and we welcome you to the South Carolina Economic Update with Dr. Joey Von Nessen. We are excited about this webinar as we're looking forward to hearing what Dr. Von Nessen has to share with us about, our economic conditions and outlook for the coming months. I serve as the lead consultant for the Midlands area of the SBDC, specifically the Columbia area office. And my goal is to help entrepreneurs and business owners leverage the appropriate tools in growing their businesses for financial freedom. Dr. Joey Von Nessen, who is our primary speaker today, specializes in regional economics, regional economic forecasting, and housing economics. If you have attended any of our previous sessions, you know that you're in for a treat. I'm going to share for a moment some background on the SBDC, and then we'll get right into Dr. Von Nessen's presentation. The SBDC is a network of business consultants across the state, and we're organized into 4 regions: USC region, South Carolina State, Winthrop, and Clemson University regions. We've been in existence here in South Carolina for over 42 years. We serve all 46 counties, and we have at present 21 centers in those counties that you can reach out to in your local area. If you're outside of the Midlands area for business consultant, one-on-one, private, confidential, no fee business consulting. This past year, here are some of the numbers that we have in what we were able to do in servicing our clientele. So we helped create close to 4,000 jobs, help over 143 businesses get started, and service close to 12,000 businesses or business owners with our consulting services. One of the things that are near and dear to my heart as a former commercial banker, is the $77.1 million that we help small businesses get access to. And then from a training perspective, training like this, we had over 10,000 attendees last year. We're probably on pace to do the same this year, particularly based on the economic conditions that we're seeing. We had a lot of people who had never experienced a downturn like we had due to COVID, and so they had a lot of questions. And so this series was born out of those questions, because we started getting a lot of questions about, how do I prepare for the future? What should I expect? And so we reached out to Dr. Von Nessen, and he was gracious enough to offer his services to help you guys understand what you need to do in order to succeed in the current conditions. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Von Nessen, and we'll get started with his presentation. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen here. And Alan, if you wouldn't mind giving me a quick confirmation that you can see it. Excellent.
I just see it.
Love it, love it. Well, perfect. Well, this is terrific. I think we're in good shape here. Well, thank you, Alan, again, and many thanks to everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, again, to talk about what's going on with our state's economy and what's going on at the national level as well, and some of the changes that we've seen this year, and what our expectations are as we approach the end of 2021 and moving into 2022. So I'll just take a few minutes and talk about the recovery to date, the level of growth that we've seen so far, and then we'll talk about where we are headed and some of the positives and negatives that we're assessing and the metrics that we're using to evaluate those as we move forward. Because the bottom line is, when we look at the South Carolina economy, this is the fundamental question that we're always still trying to answer. How is South Carolina doing? What are the best metrics we can use to keep our pulse on the answer to this question. And today, as we move into the fall and into the end of 2021, move towards the end of 2021, one way to frame this discussion that I think is very appropriate is to consider the fact that we are entering a period that I would call a post-stimulus economy, even though we're not moving into a post-COVID economy. So what does that mean? Well, if we think about a post-stimulus economy, that basically refers to the fact that most of the stimulus dollars, especially those that were geared primarily towards boosting consumer spending, have largely worked their way through the US economy. And so in a real sense, most of the stimulus is behind us now. And so the economy is going to have to stand on its own 2 feet more and more as we get closer to the end of the year. And that's going to be a reality that we face even as we're seeing this surge in COVID cases as a result of the Delta variant. So we're not in any sense to a post-COVID economy yet, and it looks like we won't be there at least until early 2022. But we are definitely moving towards a post-stimulus economy. And so the way we think about the industries that are recovering and how they are likely to recover going forward, we need to keep in mind both of these elements as we move through the rest of 2021. Now, if we think about South Carolina's economic recovery, before we talk about the future, I want to briefly bring us up to speed on the recovery that we have seen today, just to give you some context. And the best way to do this overall, the best way to start is by looking at South Carolina employment trends. This gives us a snapshot of what our recovery has looked like going back to February of 2020, when the COVID pandemic really hit the US. And as you can see here, there were basically 3 primary phase changes for the South Carolina economy since early 2020. The first was the period between February and April of 2020, where we saw the mandatory government shutdown that resulted in a loss of about 308,000 jobs for South Carolinians, or about 14% of our total workforce. And now that we're pretty far removed from that period, it really is even more extraordinary when we think about these types of numbers. 14% of the jobs in South Carolina were lost in just a very short 60-day period. Again, just totally unprecedented in terms of anything that we've seen before. But that's what's reflected there on the left side of your screen. That was immediately followed by what we call a V-shaped recovery pattern, where the economy reopened and we saw a rapid rebound and a movement back towards a period where we saw many of the jobs that were lost that were reclaimed and people were going back to work. That lasted till essentially around July 4th or around mid-July. And then the economy moved into a U-shaped recovery pattern, what economists call a U-shaped recovery, where we've seen more slow and steady growth. And that's where we are today. And that's where we've been since that period. And except for 2 months, we've seen positive employment growth in every single month going back to April of 2020. So we've seen very, very steady and stable employment gains in South Carolina, even though the pace has slowed somewhat since the beginning of the recovery. And you can see that by just the slope of this line. It's really leveled out a bit. It's still increasing, but not nearly as significantly as it was during the summer months of last year. And that's normal. That's what we would expect as the economy reopens. And so when we put all this together, we find that as of the most recent employment data that we have access to, which is August of 2021, we've recovered to within 2.7% of pre-recession employment levels. So South Carolina employment today is about 2.7% below where it was before the pandemic began. And that puts us in very good shape relative to the national average and relative to our border states, Georgia and North Carolina. South Carolina overall has been doing well in terms of our recovery relative to the recovery pace of other states. Now, the major exception to this good trend for the state is the leisure and hospitality sector. And this is a slide I've shared with you all before. And I show it again because I still think it is the best visual representation for where South Carolina's recovery is right now. Because it illustrates, on the one hand, the fact that overall, most of our industries are doing very well. And if we throw out the leisure and hospitality sector for just a moment and ignore it, and just look at all other sectors, we're actually within 2% of pre-recession employment levels. As you see here, 1.9%. And most industry sectors, aside from leisure and hospitality, have either fully recovered or they have mostly recovered, meaning they're within about 3 percentage points or so of pre-recession employment levels. So overall, most sectors in South Carolina are doing very well right now. Of course, leisure and hospitality is the exception to that. You can see still down about 10%. Fortunately, leisure and hospitality has been doing better throughout the summer. The tourism season ramped up and we saw pretty sizable growth in leisure and hospitality over the last 2 to 3 months, but still down 10% because leisure and hospitality really fell a long way. Leisure and hospitality lost 50% of their jobs between the 60-day period from February 2020 to April of 2020. So literally half of the leisure and hospitality sector was lost in that 60-day period. Again, extraordinary numbers when we look back on it, and it just takes a long time to climb out of that hole. So part of the reason leisure and hospitality is still struggling is simply because they fell so far. But this graph does, I think, a good job of really highlighting that difference and really the dichotomous nature of the recovery that we have seen to date in South Carolina. Now, we can also look beyond employment trends and look to overall economic growth. But first, I want to look a little bit more at the employment recovery itself and just look at some of the different industry sectors, just to give you a bit more of a breakdown of these sectors. So this just illustrates the point that most industry sectors in terms of employment are doing fairly well, aside from leisure and hospitality in terms of the percentage relative to pre-pandemic levels of employment. So on the left side of your screen, for example, there that bar represents that 97% simply means that current South Carolina employment levels are 97% of the level that they were at in February of 2020. And you can look across the board, and again, most industries are either fully recovered or mostly recovered. And two, I'll draw your attention to, construction being one major sector that is more than fully recovered. This graph is limited at 100%, but both for construction and for trade, transportation, and utilities, in both cases, employment is well over 100% of the level it was at in February of 2020. So very strong growth because housing has been doing so well, and because transportation, warehousing, distribution, all of those different services contained within trade, transportation, and utilities here have been doing extraordinarily well. Think of people staying home and ordering more and more goods online, right? Something that we've all been participating in. And as a result, this sector has been doing very well. Again, leisure and hospitality sticks out here as the outlier. Still only at about 90% of pre-recession employment levels, as we talked about on the previous slide. So as I mentioned, it's more than just employment. Employment is important, but we also have to look at what's driving that employment and look at what other elements are driving this recovery. And GDP growth is the best single measure that we can use to gauge the overall health of the national economy. And this just gives you some perspective on how GDP growth has seen significant changes in the last year and a half. Again, we're all familiar with these changes, generally speaking. You can see the recession in 2020 highlighted in red, followed by the strong growth that we've seen since then. And the most recent estimate of GDP growth, 6.6% in the second quarter of 2021. And we expect for relatively high rates of growth through the rest of this year as we continue to recover. And we'll talk about some of the mitigating factors that may lessen our expectations compared to what they were several months ago when we get closer to the end of the talk. But for the moment, I just want to draw your attention to the very strong growth that the U.S. has been seeing this year, particularly when we compare to the last decade. Where when we look at long run rates of growth, they've been closer to between 2 and 3%. That's typically the average growth rate in a more normal economic expansion, which is what we saw over the last decade. Very consistent and stable growth. And so growth now is still in recovery mode. So we do anticipate that growth will slowly revert closer to 3% as we move into 2022. Down from the current high levels that are more indicative of a recovery than an ongoing expansion period. But what's been driving this GDP growth? Well, one major factor has been consumer spending. Consumer spending is the biggest single contributing factor to GDP. It's about 70% of total GDP. So when we're tracking US economic growth, it's important to track consumer spending. And notice here that consumer spending has fully recovered now, just in the last couple of months, fully recovered from the pandemic, in the sense that if we were to go back to 2019 and predict what consumer spending would look like today, based on nothing but the historical trend, which you can see graphed on that black line there, we'd actually be pretty close, right? If we were to just use that historic trend line to predict where consumer spending is today. And in fact, we're slightly above where we would otherwise expect ourselves to be. So consumer spending has come a long way. You can see the major dip in 2020 and the pretty solid recovery that we have seen since then. So this is very good news as we move forward. The fact that consumer spending has basically fully recovered from where we were certainly back in April of 2020. But this does beg the question, though, of generally speaking, how have housing markets responded? And even more broadly, how have markets responded overall? I want to use housing markets as a specific case study today to talk about how to interpret some of these metrics, but we want to think more generally about how markets are responding as a whole. Because one of the differences that you've picked up on already from looking at these numbers is that if you look at employment has not fully recovered, but consumer spending has. And so that leads to implications for different markets. One implication we're going to come and talk about later is the labor shortage that has emerged. And that's an important factor in terms of looking at growth moving ahead. And one of the reasons for that at a very basic level is that demand has completely recovered, whereas employment levels have not. And so that's naturally going to lead to a labor shortage. But more generally, let's talk about other factors that have responded or other markets that have responded in certain ways, and talk about why that has happened. And I want to use, as I mentioned, housing markets as a case study here, because housing markets have done extraordinarily well over the last year and a half, as we all know. And here's some data that just point that out. On the left side of your screen, you can see total sales volume changes from essentially late spring of 2021 compared to late spring of 2019. Throwing out 2020 just because there was so much volatility in the data that year. But essentially, regardless of which metric we use to measure housing demand growth, you see that double-digit growth is a norm, right? So whether we're looking at US new home sales or existing home sales, or looking more closely to South Carolina data, again, double-digit growth is the norm and not by any means an exception. And we see similar trends on the right-hand side of your screen when we look at changes in median house prices. So you can see, again, very strong growth in 2021 compared to any year previously over the past decade. So very strong increases in demand and very strong increases in overall pricing. And again, the question there is why? What's been driving that? And specifically, what is it about the recovery that we have seen over the last year and a half that has driven this growth in housing markets, and how is that likely to change going forward? So we'll use that as a case study, as an example, looking at the housing market, and then we can generalize from there about how we can think about the economy and the recovery in different sectors as a whole. So first of all, why has the housing market done so well? Well, there are three primary answers to that question, three primary factors that drive that answer. The first is what I'll call employment stability. And this is the idea that if we look at the employment losses over the last year in the aftermath of the pandemic, they were largely, as we've already talked about, in the leisure and hospitality sector, in the service sector. And the leisure and hospitality sector essentially hires workers and in positions that pay wages that are relatively low compared to the state average. So they're relatively lower wage jobs. And so essentially what we saw was that the unemployment over the last year and a half has been disproportionately concentrated among individuals who are working in lower wage jobs and are therefore more likely to be renting than to be buying homes. And so if you are a builder or a developer, or you are a real estate agent, then your primary buyers were far less affected than the average person in the US last year, because the buyers that your potential buyers were less likely to be in that market segment that was disproportionately hit by the pandemic. And we can see that very clearly here in this graph, which shows South Carolina employment levels compared to January of 2020. And notice we break this down into relatively lower wage jobs and relatively higher wage jobs. And of course, we can debate about whether, where that cutoff should be. But for the purposes of this analysis, it's at 27,000 per year. And just notice when you use that as the line of demarcation for thinking about higher versus lower wage jobs, look at the difference in terms of the recovery rate. And look at the difference in terms of where the employment levels are today compared to pre-pandemic, right? So very, very different depending on which wage level we're looking at in terms of jobs. And so again, from the perspective of a real estate agent or a builder or a developer, if your primary customer base is for individuals who are earning more than that $27,000 a year, which it typically would be, because those are going to be the people that can afford a home, then your demand is largely unaffected. So that's why we could see relatively high unemployment in 2020, coupled with strong housing demand, because those buyers and those potential buyers were less likely to have been affected by the pandemic in terms of loss of employment. Now, there are other factors as well that apply more generally across the board, especially across the durable goods market. One of those factors is what we call the income effect. And that is simply the idea that when people have more income, more disposable personal income, then they're going to be spending more in the economy. So very, very basic premise there, of course. And we've seen that effect come true over the last year because of the stimulus dollars that flowed through the economy in 2020, largely in the form of stimulus checks that we're all familiar with, and more generous unemployment benefits that were provided because people who were unemployed were able to claim unemployment dollars both from the state and from federal supplements as well. And so when you put that together, we saw much higher disposable income levels for Americans over the last year. And you can see that very clearly here if we look at disposable personal income and track that over time. And just like with consumer spending in general, before the pandemic, the growth in disposable personal income, you can see was a very, very consistent pattern. So that's a very tight trend line that you see, that black line fitted on the actual data for the blue line there. So not a whole lot of variation. But we see some significant changes in 2020 and 2021. So disposable personal income well above historical averages and where we would expect it to be otherwise. Again, that's largely due to to the stimulus dollars that we have seen flow through the economy. Notice also that personal income now in the last couple of months has reverted back to its historical trend, right? So that blue line just in the last couple of months has gotten very close to the black line, which suggests that disposable personal income, while being elevated for a period of many months, is now moving back down to post-pandemic to pre-pandemic levels. And that will have implications when we come back and talk about where our economy is headed next. Along a similar fashion with disposable personal income, we've also seen personal savings rates that have been much higher than what we would normally expect during a normal period of economic expansion. So for a certain period, for a very short period, they well more than doubled. So you can see here savings rates for Americans typically around 7%, but much higher in the last year or so. Again, for the same reason, because Americans have had access to more dollars, and they have been seeing more income, and part of that income they have been saving, which is also very, very positive. And as a result, they have more financial resources. And so, like with disposable income in recent months, we also see that savings rate coming back down to more pre-pandemic levels. So in both the case of the disposable personal income and the savings rates, even though those were elevated for a period, they're now coming back down to pre-pandemic levels. And so I think so overall, I like to lump these two together and just to call this overall the income effect. The idea that Americans have had more disposable income and that's allowed them to spend more, which is one of the reasons why we've seen such a rapid rebound in consumer spending over the last year. And then the third effect, we talked about employment preservation, the income effect, and this third effect I think is the most important to consider, and that's the substitution effect. So both the income and the substitution effects are important, but this one we really need to drill down on because this has the potential to change back and forth in response to changes in the number of COVID cases. So what is the substitution effect? Well, again, getting back to basic supply and demand and thinking about economics 101, consumers can spend on two types of goods, broadly speaking. Overall goods, durable goods in particular, and services. So two types of items, I should say. So durable goods and services. And so what's happened over the last year is when the economy was largely shut down, and the services sector in particular, because people were looking to social distance and were uncomfortable going out in public, they were basically substituting their spending away from services and towards the goods market and durable goods in particular. And housing is one type of durable good, is a subset of durable goods. So as we've already seen, while consumer spending has completely recovered overall, that is not true at all when we look at durable goods and services, when we actually break it down. And you can see the durable goods market has done exceptionally well over the last year and a half or so. And the services market is still struggling a bit to catch up. So even though consumer spending overall, again, back to pre-pandemic levels, the durable goods market is doing very well. The services market still has a ways to go. And that's simply because people have shifted towards more spending on goods and away from spending on services. And this metric, or this set of metrics, or phenomenon that I'll call the substitution effect, is really, really important to monitor as we go forward. Because as we see the Delta variant generate a surge in cases, as we see cases come back down in the future, we're going to see movement back and forth between spending on goods and spending on services. The more people are comfortable being out and about in public, the more safe they feel, the more likely we're going to see a quick rebound in services and a substitution away from durable goods. So just as last year, for example, you might have seen a family who postponed a vacation and instead spent those dollars on renovating their house or a down payment on a new house. This year, you may see the opposite if they feel more comfortable and they're wanting to get out and travel some. So depending on the number of cases, we're likely to see movement back and forth between durable goods and services. And so that's going to be very important to watch. And I call this phenomenon more generally an economic tug-of-war, which is, I think, a good way to really encapsulate this phenomenon of the substitution effect. Right now, more consumers are substituting towards services and away from durable goods. Notice that even though durable goods has been really elevated, it's come back down in the last several months, right? And then if you look at services on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that it has had a steep incline in its growth in the last several months as well. So as we've seen more people vaccinated, as we've seen tourism season ramp up, that's caused people to shift back over to purchasing more on services. That's likely to continue, but the Delta variant and an increase in cases may mute some of those effects. So we may not see movement back towards those pre-pandemic spending patterns quite as quickly as we have in the last several months. So this economic tug-of-war, very important for us to keep our eye on going forward. And we can see some of the implications in the housing market, going back to our case study, because as we've seen people move away from durable goods and back to services, we would anticipate that the housing market would see some tapering off as well, since housing is one type of durable good. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. So I'm just going to quickly go through a few visuals that illustrate housing sales through the summer months of this year. You can see that after peaking in 2021 and sales activity well above anything we've seen in the last several years, it's come back down, right? It's come back down during the summer of 2021 as we move into the fall months. We see it here. If we look at new single-family home sales, we see it if we look at existing single-family home sales. Again, the same phenomenon. We see a major surge, and then we see it taper off a bit, moving back towards pre-pandemic levels of 2019 and early 2020. And we can see this for South Carolina as well. If we look at data from the multiple listing service in South Carolina, not quite as dramatic here, but nonetheless, you can see an increase in 2020 and then a bit of a pullback in 2021. Why is that the case? It's because consumers, generally speaking, are moving back towards purchasing on services and less purchasing of durable goods, of which housing is a part. So we can see this have an effect in different markets. This is also going to be true in manufacturing and across markets in the US. So depending on the business that you're in, this may affect you differently, but the substitution effect is going to matter for all businesses in all sectors. So it's an important metric to watch in this economic tug of war. All right, so now let's look ahead in terms of what we are anticipating for the rest of 2021. We've had a good recovery so far. Growth has been very strong through the first half of the year and into the summer months, or I should say through the summer months. And so the question is, what do we need to be on the lookout for going forward? And I would suggest to you that there are three things that should be at the front of your, or that you should be tracking regularly, should be at the forefront. The potential for persistent high inflation being one, the potential for a persistent labor shortage is number two, and then the Delta variant, of course. And the first two metrics here, potential high inflation and the labor shortage, are actually tied together in a very important way, which I want to come back to and address. But first, let's talk about inflation overall and the challenges associated with inflation and how we think about that. So we can look at inflation overall in terms of the basic measure of inflation, and this tracks it back to 2010, just to give you some perspective on what inflation levels have been overall over the past decade. And you can clearly see the spike that we have experienced in 2021. Overall inflation right now at 5.2%. Core inflation, which is looking at all goods and services except for food and energy, because that's very volatile. Core inflation is measured at 4%, and that's the measure that the Federal Reserve typically tracks. And the Federal Reserve is targeting inflation at 2%. So again, just to give you some numbers for gauging the relevance of these two numbers that you see here. Total employment 5.2%, core inflation. Total inflation 5.2%, core inflation 4%. Target inflation from the Fed is 2%, and really anything above 3% is where we get into muddy waters, where we begin to get concerned that inflation is too high. So inflation, particularly core inflation above 3%, is really a benchmark that we need to be monitoring because that's an important factor that the Fed uses. One other track we can look at is month-over-month inflation. So this shows us clearly that inflation has spiked this year, but there's some good news that it may be beginning to come back down because this looks at month-over-month inflation. And you can see that, again, it spiked considerably in 2021 above any level that we've seen in the last decade, but also notice that in the last 2 months, the month-over-month change has come down quite a bit. Which is good news because it suggests that we are seeing some tapering off. But that does raise the broader question of how long inflation is likely to stay with us and what lower inflation really means. Because so far, the good news is that the inflation that we have seen to date, that 5.2% inflation that you see here, has largely been the result of an increase in demand associated with the service sector. And the way we know that is that if you look at the major factors that are driving inflation, there are primarily 4 items: used car prices, gasoline, airline fees, and lodging fees. And what all 4 of those items have in common is that they are being driven by an increase in demand that has followed an increase in demand in the service sector, or a recovery of the service sector. And that suggests that as the service sector rebounds and stabilizes, its demand stabilizes overall, then we're likely to see inflation, the overall inflation rate, come back down. So that's very positive. However, what that does leave out is how we would know if inflation were likely to be longer lasting. What would we want to be looking for to assess, what metric do we want to watch to assess whether or not inflation is going to be with us into 2022? And the answer comes back to labor and this labor shortage. Because wage growth, as you see here, that results from labor shortages is by definition inflationary. So let me describe that for a moment with an example. Think about a business that's producing 100 units of output of any type of good. So if that business, which is producing 100 units of output, all of a sudden can't find workers, and they're having to raise wages to find the workers and attract them to work for their company, then they're now still producing the same level of output, those 100 units, but they're having to pay more for the labor. And part of that cost isn't likely to be passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So now you have the same 100 units being produced for a higher price. And that by definition is inflation. Now, wage growth isn't always inflationary when it's associated with higher levels of productivity, which is what we normally see in an expansion. But when it's primarily driven by a labor shortage, it tends to be more inflationary. So even though as we move forward, we're likely to see inflation come down as the demand in the service sector stabilizes, that could be somewhat offset by a persistent labor shortage that puts upward pressure on wages due to the shortage, which again is inflationary. So these are going to be counterbalancing impacts as we move forward. So to the extent that the labor shortage stays with us, we're likely to see inflation rates above what we had previously seen before the pandemic began. And so it's going to be very critical to continue to monitor the labor shortage itself, because to the extent that that is mitigated in the coming months, that will also help inflation come back down a bit faster, which of course is something that we would like to see. Now, is that likely? Well, what are the causes of our labor shortage? So just very briefly, I'm going to go through four major factors that have been driving the labor shortage over the last year. And I'll suggest to you that this first one is permanent, and the second three that you see listed here are more temporary factors. So those should mitigate in the coming months, which will help to mitigate the labor shortage. But this first bullet point will not. That's permanent, and that's the baby boomer retirements. About half of the drop in the labor force that we've seen since the pandemic began is due to baby boomer retirements. And that's likely permanent. These are baby boomers that were largely on the fence, were looking to retire at some point soon, and the pandemic basically just pushed them over. It may have been because they were laid off because their company had to shut down. It may have been because they were just ready to make a change, and they were more likely to be in a high risk category, wanted to stay home. They were thinking about retiring. Again, the conditions were just right. But the key factor here is that not only were the baby boomers retiring, but the quick stock market recovery also enabled that to happen. Because in 2008, by contrast, we had a period where the elder baby boomers at the time were just beginning to retire. And they were not able to do so in 2008 and had to delay because they saw their financial portfolio effectively collapse. And it took the average investor for about 4 years to recover all of the losses that they incurred in 2008. So baby boomers basically had to expand or extend their work life for about 4 years on average because of the stock market collapse in 2008. That didn't happen this time around. Their wealth was preserved. The stock market has recovered very nicely. And so baby boomers who had exited the labor market for a variety of reasons during the pandemic are now able to stay out if that is something that they wanted to do. So this is more of a permanent change to our labor market. We don't see the baby boomer retirements or the drop in the labor force due to the baby boomers exiting. That's not going to change. They're not coming back. But there are three other factors that are also driving the labor shortage that are likely to be mitigated in the coming months. The first is the fairly generous unemployment insurance benefits that were provided to South Carolinians and to all Americans up through June 30th. And as I mentioned before, this was the combination of the state and the federal benefits that basically meant that if you were working before the pandemic began and earning $16 an hour or less, then you were better off financially staying on unemployment up through June 30th in South Carolina when the federal benefits ended. And so that affected the labor availability for industries that were paying $16 an hour or less. And that especially disproportionately affected the leisure and hospitality and the service sector. So as we move forward, now that those benefits have expired, that's going to incentivize some people who are looking to increase the income that they're receiving to come back into the labor force. So we expect that to happen again as we move forward over the next several months. Another factor is simply caring for family members. We've seen a lot of individuals that have been staying out of the labor force simply because they are taking care of children, they're taking care of maybe aging relatives, and for any number of reasons, they are uncomfortable or unable to work for health-related concerns over COVID. And this is especially true for parents in the last year who have been staying home to take care of children and basically supervise them while they go to school virtually. And so that's been a major deterrent for them. But again, as children return to school in a more normal learning environment, we expect that parents, because they have now those additional time resources, are likely to trickle back into the labor force slowly in the coming months. And then finally, the higher disposable income and savings rates. We already talked about why those have been elevated, but one of the effects of that is that when people have more disposable income and especially more savings, then that means that they don't have to be quite as aggressive in terms of coming back into the labor force. If you can live off your savings for a while, then you can stay out of the labor force longer. Or you might just be able to be a bit more choosy about where you want to work. You don't need to take the first job that you're offered. So it basically creates a lagged effect for many people coming back into the workforce. And again, over time, we'll see those savings rates go back to pre-pandemic levels, and people will begin to re-enter the labor force and take jobs. So all three of these effects will slowly revert back to pre-pandemic norms as we move forward. And so we'll see more and more people rejoin the labor force. So that will help mitigate the shortage. But this first piece with the baby boomer retirements, again, that is a permanent change and is not likely to reverse itself. All right, so a couple quick concluding comments, and then we'll move into the Q&A session. Measuring the potential threat of the Delta variant. Again, the third headwind that we are currently facing for the US economy, and certainly in South Carolina too. How can we get a sense of what the impact this is going to have for the state's economy going forward? Well, one metric we can use is simply to look at consumer confidence. This is the way that we're going to directly see how consumers are feeling about the increase in COVID cases. Are they comfortable going out? Are they wanting now to stay home? How do they think about this? What affect the psychology of the economy? The Consumer Confidence Index is a good measure of this, a good barometer. And you can see that the Consumer Confidence Index was pretty strong, again, up through early 2020, going into the pandemic. Then it obviously fell significantly during the shutdown and has steadily recovered since then, but has seen some setbacks in the last couple of months, as you can see here. And the key is to look at how consumer confidence is affecting consumer spending, because that's not a one-to-one relationship by any means. So we have to not only look at consumer confidence, but also how that translates into changes in consumer spending. The good news is that right now, we don't anticipate that we will see a major pullback in terms of consumer psychology translating into reductions in consumer spending, because both businesses and consumers, unlike in 2020, are much more adapted to the reality of COVID this year. They are much more prepared to deal with changes in the economic landscape in a way that nobody was in early 2020. So if you're a business, you're already anticipating the possibility that your business may be affected again going into the winter this year. And you're already knowing what steps you need to take. And you have a much better handle on it than you did in 2020, just because you've been through it before. And the same logic applies to consumers as well. So the adaptability of the American public and American business is going to go a long way towards mitigating the otherwise negative effects that we would expect. So I think it's fair to say that going forward, we are likely to see the momentum, some of the momentum of the growth that we've experienced in the first half of the year blunted because of the rise in cases. But we're not looking at anything comparable to what we saw in 2020. And again, it's because we've seen people learn, we've seen businesses and consumers learn, and they know more how to adapt now. But having said that, we are seeing some effects. I said we will see some loss of momentum, and this is already being observed in the data. So if we look at the leisure and hospitality sector, and the biggest subset of the leisure and hospitality sector are this category called food and drinking places. So you can see that obviously saw a major decline in 2020 and has been recovering pretty steadily throughout 2021 after seeing a decline in 2020 up until just this last month. And you can see a bit of a blip there, right? After a steady increase throughout 2021, a little bit of a pullback. And so the question is, for the next several months, is that going to continue? Is it more going to flatline, or is that more of a temporary effect, and we'll see it resume its increase in terms of more employment? So clearly, we're seeing a mitigation of the momentum, and the question is, what does that mean going forward, and how do we see additional pullbacks or not? Again, I think the pullback likely to be fairly minimal, but it is having an effect that is definitely measurable, as we can already begin to see. And then the other way we can observe this is if we just look at companies, what companies are telling us, particularly with respect to supply constraints all over the U.S. So this is some data that come from the Small Business Pulse Survey, which you all are probably familiar with. It comes from the Census Bureau. And this just asks about questions related to supply chain issues. And what's graphed here are several questions about challenges faced by companies in the last week. And this was posed in August of 2021 and 2020. And so in each question, they're facing just as many, if not more, challenges than they were this time last year. So I'll just briefly read off what these questions mean. So the left bar there, supplier delays, basically what that's asking is whether a company has experienced supplier delays among domestic suppliers at some point within the last week. And so you can see more people said yes, or more companies said yes in 2021 than in 2020. The second set of bars, same question, but refers to foreign suppliers. The third question is about the difficulty in locating secondary domestic suppliers, foreign suppliers for the fourth bar, production delays for the fifth set of bars. Has this facility experienced any production delays in the last week? And then the final question, has this facility experienced any delivery delays? Have they had any trouble delivering product to their own customers? So regardless of how you ask the question, companies, or a greater percentage of them, are facing challenges now compared to last year, which suggests that these supply chain and labor shortages do continue to permeate the U.S. economy and are continuing to be a bottleneck on growth. So that is likely to persist through at least early 2022, as companies are still ramping up capacity and trying to deal with some of these issues in a variety of different ways. But this does tell us that the supply chain issues that we're currently experiencing not likely to be resolved in the short run. And I think will be with us for the foreseeable future, for at least the next 6 to 9 months or so. All right, so just wrapping up then, the bottom line. What is the bottom line for South Carolina? We've experienced a strong rebound. We are approaching pre-recession employment levels. In general, South Carolina's economy is doing very well in terms of our overall recovery. So I think we can be, if we look at it from a 30,000-foot view, things are looking pretty good for our state right now. The leisure and hospitality sector, the obvious exception there, it's seen some strong growth in 2021, but still remains well below pre-pandemic employment levels. So it still has a ways to go. And looking forward, I think the income and substitution effects, particularly on consumer spending and the relationship to consumer spending, those are those factors and the metrics driving changes in those factors are really what you need to be watching out for on how they impact your business, because that's going to, or how they affect the economy, because that's really going to give you some insight into how economic changes are likely to come for the rest of this year and into 2022. And will help give some insight into your business in terms of what that means for your customer base and your markets. And we're already seeing this in housing, where a movement in the substitution effect back towards purchasing services and away from durable goods is having somewhat of a tapering effect on housing demand. Again, just one example of how the substitution effect has very real consequences for different markets and different industries. And then finally, last bullet point there, long run inflation is one of the biggest potential economic threats going forward. And as I mentioned before, I think the rule of thumb that you need to be tracking to give you a sense of whether the Fed is going to raise interest rates sooner rather than later is whether or not that core inflation rate remains above 3.0%. The longer it stays above 3%, the more likely we're to see the Fed raise rates sooner rather than later. So I think a good metric that you can use there to gauge what the Fed is going to be talking about. And in fact, Jerome Powell is going to be making comments today, so we'll learn what their latest perspective is on the recovery today. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to turn it back over to Alan, and I'll be happy to take any questions, and we can kind of go from there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Von Nessen. Rich content, real rich content. And thank you for going over your last slide and giving us some takeaways. Are there any questions? You can post them in the chat. Carolyn, I'm not sure if we want to unmute if there are questions.
They can post them in the chat, would be awesome. Did you want me to go ahead and show the audience the state website and access to previously recorded events?
Let's wait a few minutes to see if we get any questions.
Okay. So far, we don't have any questions.
Yeah, I think I might pull them away. So in the absence of a question at the present time, I'll use one of my prepared. So Dr. Von Nessen, I mentioned clients that have capital now, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the stimulus, and you mentioned stimulus funding from a personal perspective, but there are some business owners that have capital now that they might have gotten from the EIDL, which is an SBA lending product. If I have capital now, should I be looking to deploy that capital now as a small business owner based on what you're seeing happening in South Carolina? Or should I wait more so to the second quarter of next year?
So that's a great question. It really depends on your industry and your individual business, but I think we are likely to see continued recovery going forward. So I think businesses need to be hyper aware or try to be hyper aware of opportunities, of new opportunities, as we see markets changing so fast. And one example of that would be the service sector. So we talk about how we have this labor shortage, and we're seeing that effect to some degree in terms of poorer service in some businesses as a result, because they simply can't find the labor that they need. And so that opens up an opportunity in the service sector, as an example, to provide a high quality service that is very much different from what customers are getting elsewhere in the market. And that could be by providing an augmented product, a certain type of service that simply isn't available. It could be providing customer or product expertise. It could be any number of things. And that is an opportunity that businesses can take advantage of, because there is a a gap in the market for that. Again, that's just one example of how the changes in our economy have opened up an opportunity for individuals or certain businesses to be able to potentially capture. So I think there's a lot of opportunity now. We're going to be seeing continued recovery, but major changes to some of the fundamentals in terms of the demand structure for what customers are looking for, and small business owners need to be attuned to that so that they can take advantage of the opportunities when they present themselves. And these COVID dollars are a great resource for that, for when they do encounter or recognize these opportunities.
Oh, great answer. So
we do have a couple of questions. I'm sorry.
No,
So,
go ahead.
Mr. Terrence Jackson, thank you for your question. And I might be able to answer this one. Where can I find funding to float government contract projects? I know here in the Charleston office, and you may have done this as well, Alan, we have worked with government contracting companies to assist them with working with a bank to get a line of credit to fulfill government contracts. Alan, do you have any other suggestions on that question?
Oh, that's a great question, Terrence. So we do work with banks across the state to do that, and some alternative lending companies like factoring companies. Now, you notice I kind of slowed down when I said factoring companies, because all factoring companies are not equal, and we recognize that. But if you reach out to your local SBDC office, there's a consultant in that office that could point you in the right direction. So feel free to do that, and we'll be more than happy to help you kind of walk through that particular process for your specific company.
Thank you, Alan. The second question comes from Sean Brown. What are the major factors contributing to material shortages and supplier delays? What needs to happen to recover from this?
So that's a great question. And there are several factors. One primary factor is the labor shortage, which is partly the result of the fact that demand has come back so strongly that we talked about relative to employment recovery. So consumer spending is completely recovered, whereas labor is not. Employment is still down. And for durable goods, which is really what, when you talk about material shortages, that really affects the durable goods market. That's where we've seen this huge spike in demand. So it's a combination of the fact that we've seen a surge in demand with that limited supply of labor. And of course, that is largely due to COVID, with trouble recruiting workers, and of course with new outbreaks and the effects that has on manufacturers. In South Carolina, we see auto manufacturers that have had to periodically shut down at several points throughout the year, including this summer. Just in the last several weeks, there have been different manufacturing companies that have had to shut down as a result of basically supply shortages. And so this is, we're seeing this effect around the world. We're seeing it in South Carolina. But bottom line is, it comes from that surge in demand coupled with the limited amount of labor availability. And to give you a specific example of that, consider what's going on with the new car, or I should say the new and the used car market right now. So used car prices have gone up about 42% year over year overall, which is again just an extraordinary change. But that's the result of two primary factors. Number one is that the semiconductor shortage has created a limiting factor for the production of new cars. And so people that were going to buy a new car are now instead having to substitute and buy used cars instead. So you have a demand factor there. And then on the flip side, as the service sector comes back and more people are looking to travel, rental car companies are now in the market for vehicles. So you've got that on all sides there. And as a result, you see this spike in prices. I think going forward, to answer the question regarding how long is this likely to stay with us, it takes a while for capacity to increase, because with the semiconductors and with some of the other shortages that we're seeing, in order to scale up capacity, that's an investment in fixed assets. And that doesn't happen overnight. That takes a period of months, which is why we don't anticipate the supply chain shortages seeing significant or alleviating those until sometime in 2022, just because it takes time to build up the infrastructure to address that higher demand. And that's also exacerbated by the fact that companies, in some cases, don't necessarily have an incentive to ramp up their infrastructure immediately, because some companies are of the mindset that if demand stabilizes or comes back down, then they may be in a position where they've invested and now the demand isn't sustainable for what they were expecting. So that's causing them to maybe hold off a bit before investing in new infrastructure. So it's something that we will see solved over time, but unfortunately it's not a short run fix, and we anticipate these supplier challenges to be with us at least into 2022.
So Dr. Von Nessen, you bring up some things that we talk about here at SBDC in our internal meetings. And one of which is what we're paying attention to is what we call the economic bubble that may exist as it relates to demand. But in relationship to the supply chain, from a historical perspective, have you seen an increase in automation in the manufacturing space when supply chain constraints get to the degree that we see them now, that manufacturers tend to put more into R&D as opposed to personnel, and look for ways to replace personnel through automation?
So the short answer is yes. The manufacturers are always looking for ways to automate and improve their technology. But that primarily comes when you see a need to raise wages significantly, and the cost of R&D and technology becomes comparable to hiring new personnel. So they're not necessarily looking to automate. They're always looking to improve their technology and to advance productivity in whatever ways that they can. But the technology, when it becomes relatively cheaper, the more expensive labor becomes for any reason, including a shortage, then the less relative cost would go into investing in technology because they're more equal. And so you do tend to see historically manufacturers automate and embrace newer technologies faster when you're in a situation where you see significant labor shortages. So that is true. But that also means that they're looking to train workers as well, because they're, in a sense, not only are they looking to automate, but they're also looking to hire workers to run these machines. And so workforce training becomes a critical element too. And that's something we didn't really talk about, but it's not just about a labor shortage for the service sector, although that's a significant part of it. If you look at manufacturing and housing markets and industries, these are highly skilled positions that are paid well over $30 an hour right now, and they're facing significant labor challenges too. But that has nothing to do with the financial incentives associated with unemployment insurance, for example. That's all about finding workers and training them appropriately. So that's a workforce training challenge that they're facing, which is very real and very prevalent. So that's very, very important as we look ahead.
Thank you. Carolyn, are there any more questions?
Excuse me, I was unmuting. Sean Brown said, provided, and thank you, Mr. Brown, follow up. I keep hearing about vast amounts of unfinished automobiles. What happens to the automotive market when the chips are delivered and they are released into supply, if anything?
Well, there is a pent-up demand for automobiles right now. So when we see an increase in supply, that should help taper off the increase in prices, and hopefully will stabilize the market. We'll see how quickly that happens, but an increase in supply is really what would help reduce pricing and reduce these price increases. So I think that would be a positive once we get to that point.
My last question, Dr. Von Nessen, infrastructure bill. Any implications on what you think that would do to inflation, to economic growth as it relates, to the country, but in particular to South Carolina?
Well, I think to the extent that the dollars are being used for specific infrastructure projects in South Carolina, again, we're still learning about the details of the bill, but we do have some infrastructure needs in South Carolina. There's no question about that. So, the expansion of 26 and of maintaining our roads and our highway system, very important. We hear a lot about broadband access. That's talked about a lot. That's very important. So there are important infrastructure projects that, if these dollars can be used for those in South Carolina, would set us up very well for growth for the next decade. The other, again, we're still waiting to see how this comes out. I think from a tax perspective, the one area I would have most concern at this point is regarding the corporate tax, because the lowering of the corporate tax that we saw in recent years companies have mentioned and stated regularly that has made the U.S. more competitive for investments. In South Carolina, we have a lot of foreign direct investment in this state, and those lower corporate tax rates has made it much more financially attractive for companies to be here. So I think that is something that would need to be looked at very carefully. I think that has the potential to have some impact for the state as well. So we need to be tracking the corporate tax rate and any change to it. I think as much as any other element of the bill. But there's a lot unknown. Having said that, again, we're just getting a feel for what that's likely to be and how the infrastructure bill is going to take shape.
Awesome. So Carolyn, we are a few minutes over. I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank everyone for attending.
I just wanted to share with everyone the state site, which is the South Carolina Small Business Development Center site. If you are looking to attend any future events, if you go to our state site, scsbdc.com, and the training events header, this gives you a list of all of the events that are coming up. And below that, you will see view recordings of previous training events. This is our library of events that date back to June of 2020. So many of these things may be very helpful to you. You may find that your business consultant refers you to one of these to watch. And we just want everyone to be aware that this is available to you or anyone else, again, at no cost. We will be posting today's event on the website probably within a week. Again, we will be sending out a post-event survey, and those individuals that respond to the post-event survey will receive the slide presentation from today and a link to the recording. And we anticipate doing that approximately a week from today, which will be September the 29th. So that is really all that I had today. Terrence Jackson just entered something. My apologies, Alan. Since all companies have to and mostly ship out their products on wooden pallets, do you have any information on how the historically high lumber prices have affected the prices of pallets? And are the prices of pallets starting to come back to normal?
So that's a great question. I don't have specific information on how it impacts the price of pallets specifically, but we are seeing lumber prices come back down, and significantly so in the last few months as housing demand has tapered. So that will have some effect on any product that uses lumber as a primary input, including obviously wood pallets. But so the good news there is that we are seeing lumber prices come back down. But unfortunately, we have not tracked any data that specifically ties those two together in terms of the cost of pallets.
So there aren't any other questions. So Alan, was there anything else that you would like to add today?
No, I would just like to thank Dr. Von Nessen again for taking the time out of his schedule to present today. Rich content. I think I'm gonna have to go back and watch it 4 times to get everything out of it. And to that point, please take advantage of the webinars that we have on our website. You can benefit from them. You can gain some insights to help you get the right market intelligence, to help you sustain and grow your business. Thank you again. As I always say, keep calm and small business on.
Thank you, Alan. And with that, we will end the presentation. And again, thank you for your attendance.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carolyn.
My pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.